Hi, everyone. Welcome to Mystic Dog Mama, the podcast for soul led dog mamas, where you'll discover how to best nourish your dog and yourself, mind, body, and soul. I'm your host, Dr. Alexia Meller. So, welcome. This is a little bit of an informal, impromptu solo summer session that I wanted to do a quick little episode for you on because a wonderful listener got in touch with me. We were just having a conversation about energetics, actually, of our dogs and how do we better understand um, what our dogs' constitutions are, and then how do we adjust the diet accordingly. So I kind of wanted to talk about this. We have talked about it a bit on previous episodes, specifically with Hannah Zulueta and with Rita Hogan. So if you're interested in energetics, I would definitely check out those two episodes if you haven't done so already. But I wanted to share some things that have been helpful for me in looking at how I apply energetics to Lucky, and then also how I apply that to other client dogs that I'm working with. But I'll start with Lucky as a kind of key example because he sort of presented some sort of challenges for me initially for thinking about what his personality type was as an indicator of what his constitution was, and then how I would address things. So, first of all, if you're looking for a resource for how to start thinking about your dog's energetics, Dr. Judy Morgan actually has a pet personality free download that you can get from her website that gives you a checklist of different personality traits that are associated with each one of the 5 elements. And you can see which one you sort of go through, you check which ones you notice within your dog, and then you see what they are kind of dominant in, and that's their personality. But I wanted to add a little bit of caveat around that because, first of all, and I'm sorry for the background noise, I wanted to do this outside, and that's part of it. But um, I think it's also important to think about when we're looking at those sorts of checklists that we are assessing our dogs over a period of time and in different contexts to get a clear indication of what they are most dominant with. And I'll get to that in a second. But this also relates to something that Hannah Zulueta was talking about. And she was always saying that we have to ask in relation to what. And I think that's such an important little reminder for us as you're going through this checklist and thinking about, well, sure, my dog presents as vocal, or my dog presents as aggressive, or my dog presents as really frightened. In relation to what, and what are those contexts? And as you start to look at a number of different types of contexts, and you start to see patterns, that will help you figure some things out. So I just wanted to say that's a great resource. Also, I wanted to say that yes, our dog's constitution is important for when we're thinking about feeding our dogs. But I also think, as Rita Hogan talked about, understanding the spectrum of cool to warm and where our dog lies on that, in my opinion, is a much more important way of assessing how we then support our dogs through diet, because that is what will push a dog into a state closer to disease or a state closer to health, is when we are able to modify the energetics from the cool to warm perspective. So not just about the particular element. But that being said, I thought I would kind of go through some little notes that I've made on some things that came to me actually fairly recently to really help me identify Lucky. Now, Lucky is a cool dog, and he's also a water dog. And so what that means is, especially if you're using Judy Morgan's sheet with the kind of categories. So the water dog is governed by the kidneys. And I had an issue, I've talked about this before early on in my journey with Lucky, where he started to present some issues with his kidneys when he was younger. So also looking at what are some common health conditions that your dog has in presently, or has had in the past, that might indicate a particular system that is perhaps weaker. For him, it was his kidneys. But that wasn't the thing that really necessarily convinced me that he might be leaning more towards being a water dog. There was actually looking at various ways in which he reacts. So I've talked about Lucky being a reactive dog. And when we look at reactivity, that can present as a kind of form of aggression. But again, it's understanding, where is that behavior coming from? What is the source of it? And that indicates, like, that's also reflective of like the organ source, the system source. But also, like, what is the cause of it? What is the reason that the dog is behaving in that way? So I wanted to pull up a couple of examples, because when you look at Judy's sheet, which is really great. One second, I'm pulling it up for myself. You can see things like, we see assertive listed under wood, for example, and then we also have like impulsive, easily angered. These things can be related to reactivity, but so can fear biting, for example, which is found within the water element, or we can even see aggression within the fire element. So there are kind of common traits that are characteristics of each of the profiles. And I think it's also important to remember that every being, so this applies to humans, every dog has all 5 elements within them. It's just looking at which is the more dominant one. So for Lucky, he's often, I've mentioned this in the podcast, he's often referred to as like bravo in Spanish, like meaning that he is a little bit aggressive, he's a little bit dominant, that kind of a thing. And so he could easily be labeled as possibly kind of fire in that context, especially because he's quite vocal. He could also be labeled as wood, seeming to be a little bit impatient with people and a little bit aggressive. But when you look at where that behavior is coming from, why he's doing it, that's the big thing for me that points to the kidneys. He's frightened. And he's barking like that, and he's showing a form of aggression, a form of like bravado, to try and get the thing that he's not happy with away, or to warn the person or the dog or whatever that he's not comfortable with them getting closer. And I particularly saw this because sometimes he will kind of aggress towards, which is something that's more associated with the kind of more dominant energy of the wood element. But we had an incident where at my friend's house where I'm staying, some street dogs got into the yard, and they had knocked over our trash and they were eating the trash. They're in Lucky's territory, and he was barking like crazy to let me know that something was here. And I looked outside and I saw them at the kind of far end of the yard. Lucky was staying close to the house, and as soon as I went out to take control of it, he retreated and he was just watching from afar. For me, that was just such a big moment of like, okay, so he could have, if he were, I would say, more wood or even more fire, he would have got up and chased those dogs away. He does it to cats. He'll chase the cats. But in terms of that kind of situation, he felt threatened. He felt a little bit afraid. And so he let me take control of it. So that was something that really clicked with me, of confirming that his aggression really is coming from fear and is associated with the kidneys. So my advice is, watch your dog in a variety of different contexts. If you also have more than one pet in the house, watch when your dog is on their own, how they are responding. So when I was talking to this lovely listener who wrote in about this, she was saying that she feels like her dog's reactivity might be as a result of liver imbalance, which is associated with wood, with the wood element, because of their reactivity. And there's 2 of them. They have 2 dogs. So I suggested that she actually start to look at, how are the dogs behaving individually? Because there's also that effect that 2 fear reactive dogs, when they get together, can kind of team up, right? And it looks more aggressive. It looks more wood than it is. It might actually be more water. It could very well be that they are wood, but you would understand that not from just looking at one particular incident, but starting to look at what is the pattern, especially if you can get a look at what's going on with the dog individually, not just when they're kind of teaming up together. So that's another point to look at. The other thing I wanted to talk about was like the cool and the warm aspect of energetics, because I've had quite a few of you write in and say, "Well, I'm not totally sure if my dog runs more cool or more warm." And there are some physical characteristics that are often assigned with the elements that will possibly give you an indication of whether or not they're warm or cool. But the thing that I've found most useful, and when I work with clients, I ask them to kind of look again over a period of time in a number of different contexts, is also to look at sort of the extremes of seasons to see what's going on. So as an example, and again in relation to what? So it's summer here in the northern hemisphere. It's really hot. We're experiencing heat waves. It's often said that hot dogs, dogs who run hot, that they will kind of poop out on their walks. They'll kind of like tire really easily. They might have a spurt of energy and then they're kind of tired and they're panting a lot. Well, Lucky does that right now as well. And then oftentimes I end up having to carry him home on the walks. He's really hot and he just doesn't want to go any further. So if I'm just using that as a way of determining his energetics, I might assume that he is a hot running dog. But again, in relation to what? It's never below 85 degrees. So of course he's going to be warm when we're out and about, and it's a normal thing to have to regulate his system. He also seeks cool places, like tile floors, that kind of a thing, which would be indicative of a hot dog. But again, you kind of have to look at in relation to what? The context is it's really hot outside. But something that kind of gave things away for me was that even when we come back from the walks, and once he's had a chance to cool down a little bit, he still, even if it's just a few minutes, he will go outside and sunbathe. He'll go and lay in the direct sun. That's an indication of a dog that is a cooler dog that enjoys that kind of feeling. He only does it again for a few minutes and then he's like, ah, it's too hot. I'm going inside. But he will still seek that out. He still will, in the air conditioning, find a blanket to snuggle under, right? So he's still enjoying being a little bit warmer. That wouldn't necessarily be the case with a warm dog, right? So looking at it in terms of context, and again, looking over multiple seasons and even in the extremes of seasons. So to use the kind of opposite example, do you have a dog that can never be cool enough? Like they love like laying in the snow or they're even panting when it's really cold outside. That will give you an indication that the dog runs a little bit warmer. And like I said, I actually find that the elements are certainly helpful, but looking at the kind of cool to warm spectrum and understanding where your dog falls on that in terms of when we're using nutrition to help support the dog, to me, that's a much more helpful way of understanding what's going on with your dog. And I also think that, yes, your dog will have a particular constitution that is, and like with us, like we are born with it. But I think it's always helpful to look at what is going on with your dog right now, and you respond to the balance or the lack of balance that's taking place right now, and you adjust accordingly. So rather than just thinking, like in Lucky's case, okay, so he's a water dog, I always have to be conscious of water. That's true. And I really need to take into account how is he doing right now? He actually might need more or less water. He might need more or less things associated with fire at any given point, more or less things associated with wood, because we also have to remember that the body's systems don't operate in isolation. That's one of the most beautiful things for me about TCM is seeing the connection between all of the elements, how they support one another, how they build one another, how they can cut one another when you need to kind of bring something down that's in excess. So looking at the whole picture and looking at where your dog is right now. So another example of looking at things in context as well, when we look at the kind of characteristics that are assigned to the fire element, we can see that they're vocal, that they love to be the center of attention, right? They kind of like want all this attention and energy. And again, asking in relation to what can be super helpful because, for example, in some contexts, that's totally descriptive of Lucky. When he's around people that he's really comfortable with or other dogs that he's really comfortable with, he loves to be the center of attention. He'll be barky, he'll be demanding attention, he'll be like pawing at you, all of that. But It's only in certain contexts that he's like that. It's where he really knows and trusts the people, and that often takes a long time for him to get to that point. It's not his kind of natural, everyday, generalized tendency. So again, looking at in relation to what I think is really helpful. Another thing that can be helpful to look at too is, do you notice any kinds of changes in your dog after you feed certain proteins? So this can actually give us a little bit of an indication of an intolerance, for example, but also, do you notice that after feeding your dog lamb, that they are really hot, they start panting, and that they're kind of, they might even exhibit more vocalness or a little bit more agitation. So, for example, that could both indicate that they're a warm dog. It could also tell you that maybe they lean towards the fire. And the inverse can be true as well. Like, do you notice that if you're feeding your dog duck, for example, which is a cooling protein, that they might actually seek warmer places after doing that, regardless of the kind of external temperatures? So it's looking at these patterns over a period of time in a variety of contexts, and always asking in relation to what. And finally, I wanted to mention this isn't specifically about necessarily identifying your dog's energetic profile, either their constitution or whether or not they run towards hot or cold, but it can be an indicator of where there might be some current imbalances in your dog's system. If you start to pay attention to where, for example, they might be more obsessively grooming on their bodies or nibbling, for example, are they nibbling on their paws? Are they nibbling a bit on their arm? Do they tend to scratch a lot in a particular place? Are they sensitive to touch in a particular place? Those could obviously be indicators of pain. But I think if you start to notice like where on the body they are paying more attention to, as well as you start to pay attention to at what times of the day do you start to notice certain behaviors happening. So, for example, are they regularly having hunger pukes at a particular time? Do they get really anxious at a particular time of day? Do they have zoomies at a particular time of day? If you start to track those things and you start to see a pattern, we can start to correlate this in Chinese medicine to meridians. And particularly so the meridians on the body will give us an indicator of what systems might need some support. But also, when we start to see behaviors showing us that certain things are happening at certain times of day, the wheel of the day with TCM looks at the way in which energy flows throughout the body, and at what, and this applies to humans as well as to dogs, and at what time that energy is passing through a particular system. So systems are assigned a certain time of, it's the circadian clock. They're assigned certain times of the day. So if you're regularly seeing things happen between certain hours of the day, that could be an indicator that the organ or that organ's system, the system that it governs, might be a little bit out of balance. And that can help us figure out how to best support the dog through nutrition. So those are just some other things to kind of keep note of. Dr. Cheryl Schwarz has a fantastic book called Four Paws, Five Directions. That's a great introduction to Chinese medicine for animals. That might be a useful guide for you if you're interested in some of this stuff and you want to go a little bit more deeply. That will also give you the circadian, um, the clock that will assign certain hours to certain systems, so you can start to see that. But if you've got any questions about any of that stuff, or you've got an issue with your dog right now and you want to kind of get a little bit of clarity about that, you can always message me and I can let you know about which system that might be associated with and point you in some helpful directions if you would find that helpful. Just message me on Mystic Dog Mama on Instagram at Mystic Dog Mama. So I hope that's helpful. If you have any more questions on energetics or you want me to go into more specifics of things, let me know. I'd always love to do that. I love hearing from you guys about what's helpful, about what you'd like to know more of, how you can apply that to nutrition and to your particular dog. So send me a message on Instagram at Mystic Dog Mama and let me know. But the key takeaways I want you to think about here from this is looking at your dog in a number of different contexts, over a period of time. If you've got multiple dogs, look at the dog both in terms of how they work with the other dog, if behaviors change as a result of that, as well as really look at the dog individually. If you can get a sense of how they're operating on an individual level, and then see within all of this how you can get a better understanding of whether or not your dog runs towards the cool end or the warm end. And if you have any questions about how to actually balance any of this, I'd be more than happy to do some more Q&As on that and give you some support with that. So anyways, I hope that's helpful. I hope you're having a lovely dog days of summer, and I will talk to you next time on the next episode. Bye.